Think your job pays badly? Try being paid in beer. Not a few bottles, not a six-pack. Exactly 5.5 liters every single day. And here's the thing nobody tells you about this arrangement. It wasn't generosity, it was control. The Sumerians figured out something about human psychology 5,000 years ago that modern corporations are still using today. And by the end of this, you're going to see your own paycheck in a completely different light. So picture this. You wake up before dawn in ancient Sumer around 3000 BCE. The air is already thick with heat even though the sun hasn't fully risen yet. You're not excited about work. Nobody is. But you know what's waiting for you at the end of your shift, and that thought gets you moving. Not gold, not silver, beer. Specifically, 5.5 liters of it, measured out with the same precision that your boss today measures your productivity metrics. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand something crucial. This wasn't just about getting drunk. The beer they drank back then wasn't like the stuff you grab at a gas station. It was thick, nutritious, and honestly more like liquid bread than what we call beer today. But that's exactly what made it perfect for what the Sumerians were really doing, which was way more calculated than just keeping workers happy. Let me take you back to the beginning. Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This place is basically modern-day Iraq and parts of Syria and Turkey. It's hot. I mean, unbearably hot. The kind of heat where you can't think straight if you're not properly hydrated and fed. And in this landscape, the Sumerians built something that nobody had really managed before: actual cities. Uruk, Eridu. These weren't just villages that got big. These were planned urban centers with thousands of people living in them. And here's where the problem started. When you have thousands of people living together, they can't all just grow their own food. Someone needs to farm, someone needs to build, someone needs to make pots and weave cloth and maintain the irrigation channels that kept the whole system running. You need specialization. You need workers, and workers need to be paid. But what do you pay them with? Gold and silver existed, sure, but there wasn't enough of it to go around for every single laborer working on a canal or building a temple. You couldn't just print money. Currency, as we know it, didn't really exist yet. The Sumerians needed something that was valuable, that everyone needed, that could be produced in large quantities, and that wouldn't last forever, so people couldn't just hoard it and stop working. Beer was the answer, and it was brilliant in a way that's kind of disturbing once you think about it. The earliest evidence we have of beer in Mesopotamia dates back to around 4000 BCE, maybe earlier. We're talking about one of the first things humans figured out how to make once they settled down and started farming. And there's a reason for that. Beer wasn't a luxury. It was safer than water. The brewing process killed bacteria that would make you sick. In a world without modern sanitation, beer kept you alive. But the Sumerians took this basic survival beverage and turned it into an economic system. They standardized it, they measured it, they made it the foundation of their entire labor economy. And that 5.5 liter figure, that wasn't random. That was calculated based on what they determined a worker needed to survive and work the next day. Now, let's talk about what this beer actually was. When I say beer, you're probably imagining something cold, fizzy, maybe a nice amber color. Forget all of that. Sumerian beer was thick, like you might need to eat it with a spoon thick. It was made from barley that was partially baked into bread, then crumbled into water and left to ferment. The result was chunky, nutritious, and relatively low in alcohol compared to modern beer, probably somewhere between 2 and 5% alcohol by volume. This stuff had calories, it had nutrients, it had B vitamins from the yeast, it had carbohydrates from the grain. One ration of beer could provide a significant portion of your daily caloric needs. And because it was made from grain, which the temples and palaces controlled, it was the perfect thing to pay workers with. They controlled the supply, they controlled the distribution, they controlled you.
The rations varied based on your job. If you were a low-level laborer, you got that baseline 5.5 liters, which is about 1.5 gallons or roughly 6 modern bottles of wine in volume. If you were a higher status worker, like a scribe or an administrator, you might get more. And if you were really important, you got the good stuff, higher quality beer with more consistent flavor and fewer chunks. But here's what makes this system so interesting from an economic perspective. Beer doesn't last forever. Even in ancient times, it would start to go bad after a few days, maybe a week if you were lucky. This meant workers couldn't save up their wages and stop working. They had to keep coming back, day after day. The system was designed to create dependency. And the Sumerians knew exactly what they were doing. We have thousands of clay tablets from this period, administrative records, receipts, work orders, and they talk about beer rations constantly. These weren't casual arrangements. This was bureaucracy. They tracked who got what, when they got it, how much they worked. It was a payroll system written in cuneiform on wet clay and baked
hard as stone. One of the most famous pieces of evidence we have is something called the Alulu beer receipt, which dates to around 2050 BCE from the city of Ur. It's literally a receipt for beer given to a worker. The tablet doesn't tell us much about the person's life or feelings, but it tells us something maybe more important. This system was so standardized that they bothered to document every transaction. That level of record keeping tells you this wasn't informal, this was policy. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical workday might have looked like. You're a laborer working on one of the massive irrigation projects that kept Sumerian agriculture running. These canals were engineering marvels. They stretched for miles, redirecting river water to fields that would otherwise be desert. Digging and maintaining them was backbreaking work. You start before dawn because working in the midday heat is dangerous. You're given tools, maybe a bronze pick if you're lucky, more likely a wooden shovel or a stone implement. You work alongside dozens or hundreds of other people, all digging, moving earth, clearing silt. The overseers watch to make sure you're working at the right pace. Not too slow, but also not so fast that you tire out before the day is done. Around midday, there's a break. This is when the first distribution of beer might happen. Not all of your ration, just enough to keep you going. The beer is brought out in large pottery vessels. You line up with your fellow workers. Someone pours your portion into your own cup, which you brought from home. You drink it, feeling the thick liquid fill your stomach, the slight buzz taking the edge off your exhaustion. Then back to work until the sun starts to set. At the end of the day, you get the rest of your ration. This is the beer you might take home to share with your family, or drink yourself to ease the aches in your muscles and help you sleep. Tomorrow you'll do it all again. Now here's where things really get interesting. The beer ration system created a whole secondary economy because not everyone wanted to drink all their beer. Maybe you didn't like the taste. Maybe you wanted something else. Maybe you needed cloth or oil or bread instead. So people started trading their beer rations for other goods. Beer became a medium of exchange, almost like money, but with an expiration date. And the ruling class, the temple priests and the palace administrators, they loved this because it kept the economy flowing. People couldn't just hoard their wealth. They had to spend it, trade it, use it. This kept goods moving, kept people dependent on the system, and made sure that everyone stayed integrated into the economic structure the elite had created. But let's talk about what this meant for the workers themselves. On one hand, you had a guaranteed wage. If you did your work, you got your beer. You wouldn't starve, your family wouldn't starve. In a world without safety nets, without unemployment insurance, without any of the things we take for granted today, that guarantee meant something. It was security. On the other hand, you were trapped. You couldn't save up and quit. You couldn't build wealth that would let you escape the system. Every day, you had to work to get the beer you needed to survive. And then the beer would go bad, and you'd have to work again. It was a treadmill, and the people in charge designed it that way. The Sumerians understood something about human nature that modern economists would later formalize. People respond to incentives, but they also respond to dependencies. If you can make someone dependent on you for their basic needs, you don't need to force them to work. They'll do it on their own because the alternative is worse. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but at least they got something for their work, right? At least they weren't slaves. And that's true, but it's also more complicated than that because there were slaves in Sumerian society and they were treated differently. Slaves weren't paid in beer rations. They were given food and shelter directly, and they had no freedom to leave. Free workers had more rights, could own property, could in theory change jobs, but the beer ration system kept most of them in a state that wasn't quite slavery, but wasn't quite freedom either. Let me tell you about the women in the system, because their experience was different and often worse. Women worked in Sumerian society, especially in textile production. The temples had large workshops where women would spin wool, weave cloth, and produce the textiles that were one of Mesopotamia's main exports. These women were paid in rations too, but often less than men, even when they worked just as hard or harder. We have records from these workshops, and they're kind of heartbreaking. Lists of women's names, their children's names, and the rations they received. Many of these women were widows or had been captured in wars and put to work. Their beer rations were smaller than men's, supposedly because they were believed to need less, but really because they had less power to demand fair treatment. And here's something that really highlights how calculated this all was. Children worked too. Not all children and not in the most dangerous jobs, but children worked, and they got rations scaled to their age and size. A child might get 1 or 2 liters of beer instead of 5.5. The system accounted for everyone, categorized everyone, and made sure everyone was just secure enough to keep working, but never secure enough to leave. The temples were at the center of all this. These weren't just religious buildings, they were economic powerhouses. The temples owned huge amounts of land. They employed hundreds or thousands of workers. They brewed the beer, stored the grain, managed the rations, and kept all the records. The priests weren't just spiritual leaders, they were managers, accountants, and economists. And they justified all of this through religion. The gods owned the land, they said. The gods required the temples to be built and maintained. The gods needed offerings and festivals and rituals. The workers weren't really working for the priests, they were working for the gods. Their beer rations weren't wages from human employers, they were blessings from divine patrons. It was a brilliant piece of ideological control that made the whole system seem natural and even sacred. But let's get into the actual brewing process, because understanding how the beer was made helps explain why it worked so well as a form of payment. The Sumerians had beer goddesses. Yes, plural. The most famous was Ninkasi, and we actually have a hymn to her that's also a beer recipe. It's one of the oldest recipes in existence, and it's written as a poem of praise to the goddess. The hymn describes how barley is soaked in water, then spread out to sprout, this is malting, which converts the starches in the grain into sugars. Then this sprouted grain is dried and baked into a bread called bapir. This bapir is then crumbled into water with more malted grain, date syrup for sweetness, and left to ferment. The mixture is stirred regularly, and after a few days, you have beer. The brewing was usually done by women. This was their domain, their expertise. In households, women brewed for their families. In the temples, female brewers worked in large groups to produce the quantities needed for rations. These women had real skill. They knew how to control fermentation, how to adjust flavors, how to keep the process sanitary enough that people wouldn't get sick. They were professionals in a time when that word didn't exist, and the Sumerians took their beers seriously. They had quality standards. There are laws about beer in the Code of Hammurabi, which came a bit later than the Sumerians but inherited their traditions. Tavern keepers who watered down beer could be drowned. That's not a typo, drowned. The punishment for cheating people on their beer was death. That's how important this was to the functioning of society. But here's something fascinating. The beer ration system created social spaces. Taverns existed in ancient Sumer. They were often run by women, and they were places where people gathered, socialized, made deals, and shared information. Your beer ration might not last if you kept it at home, but you could take it to a tavern, trade some of it for food or other drinks, and spend time with other people. These taverns were vital social infrastructure, and they existed because of the ration system. Now let's talk about what happened when things went wrong. Because they did. Harvests failed, wars disrupted supply lines, administrative incompetence meant rations didn't get distributed on time, and when workers didn't get their beer, they got angry. We have records of labor strikes in ancient Mesopotamia. Yes, strikes. Workers would refuse to work if they weren't paid. They'd send delegations to complain to the authorities. Sometimes they'd even damage property or threaten violence. The ration system gave them leverage. If they didn't work, the project stopped, and the rulers needed those projects to continue for defense, for agriculture, for legitimacy. There's one particularly fascinating case from later in Mesopotamian history, during the Egyptian New Kingdom, at a place called Deir el-Medina. The workers there were building royal tombs, and they were paid in rations of grain and beer. When the rations didn't come, they organized one of the first recorded strikes in history. They stopped work and marched to the administrative offices to demand their pay. And they got it. The system only worked if it was maintained. If the contract was broken, the workers had power. But back in Sumer proper, the strikes weren't always successful. The rulers had force at their disposal. If workers became too troublesome, they could be punished, replaced, or in extreme cases, enslaved. The beer ration system worked because it balanced incentive with control. Give people enough to survive and keep working, but not enough to become independent. Keep them dependent, but not so oppressed that they rebel. It's a delicate balance, and the Sumerians maintained it for centuries. Let me tell you about a specific archaeological site that really brings this to life. At the city of archaeologists have found workers' quarters, simple mud brick houses where the laborers lived. In these houses, they found pottery vessels with residue that's been analyzed and confirmed to be beer. They found cuneiform tablets listing rations. They found evidence of daily life, broken tools, children's toys, cooking hearths. These people were real. They lived these lives we're talking about.
One tablet from lists the names of about 60 workers and the rations they received over the course of a month. The scribe who wrote it was meticulous. Each name, each amount, carefully recorded. Some workers got extra rations on certain days. Maybe they worked overtime or took on harder tasks. Some got less. Maybe they were sick or missed work. The system was flexible but controlled. The records made sure nobody could cheat, but they also made sure everyone was watched. And here's something that should make you think about your own life. The Sumerians invented bureaucracy. They created the idea that everything should be measured, recorded, and managed. managed. They turned human labor into something that could be quantified and controlled, and we still live in that world. Your employer tracks your hours, your productivity, your output. You get paid based on those measurements. The tools have changed, but the basic idea that work should be monitored and compensated according to standardized rules, that comes from the Sumerians. Now, the beer itself was central to Sumerian culture beyond just being payment. It was used in religious rituals. The gods were offered beer. Weddings celebrated with beer. Funerals involved beer. It was social glue. And because it was so important, the Sumerians developed sophisticated brewing techniques that were passed down through generations. Different cities had different beer styles. Uruk might be known for one type, for another. This wasn't just about taste. It was about identity. Where you came from determined what kind of beer you grew up drinking, and that connected you to your home, your people, your place in the world. The beer ration wasn't just food and payment, it was culture. Let's talk about the quantities again, because 5.5 liters is a lot of liquid to consume in a day. For reference, that's about 12 standard beer cans in volume. Now remember, Sumerian beer was lower in alcohol than modern beer, so drinking that much wouldn't necessarily get you falling down drunk, but it would give you a buzz, and that was part of the point. The alcohol content served multiple purposes. It made the drink more appealing than plain water. It had mild analgesic properties, meaning it helped with pain, which was important for people doing hard physical labor. It helped people sleep, and it made them slightly less likely to cause trouble or organize against their employers. A workforce that's mildly buzzed most of the time is easier to manage than one that's stone cold sober and angry about their working conditions. But this also meant that alcoholism was probably a problem. We don't have direct evidence of this from Sumerian sources, but logically, if you're consuming alcohol every day as your primary source of nutrition, some percentage of the population is going to develop dependency. And unlike today, there was no concept of alcoholism as a medical condition or a social problem. You drank your beer because that's what you were paid. If you couldn't handle it, that was your personal failing, not a systemic issue. The quality of the beer varied significantly. Temple administrators and palace officials got the best beer, clear, well-filtered, consistent in strength and flavor. Ordinary workers got whatever was produced in the most efficient and cost-effective way. This might mean beer that was over-fermented, too sour, full of sediment, or inconsistent in alcohol content. You drank what you got because the alternative was not getting paid at all. And there were different grades recorded in the administrative tablets. They had terms for fine beer, ordinary beer, and beer for the workers. The language itself encoded the hierarchy. Your social status determined not just how much beer you got, but what quality. And you knew your place by what you were given to drink. Now, let's think about the economics of this from the employer's side. Why beer instead of just giving people grain and letting them figure out their own food? First, beer spoiled faster than grain, which meant workers stayed dependent. Second, brewing beer was specialized labor that the temples controlled, which meant they controlled the entire production chain. Third, beer was more appealing than raw grain, which meant workers were more motivated to work for beer than they would be for wheat.
But there is another factor. Beer production converted grain into something that was less valuable in bulk, but more valuable in distribution. A sack of grain is heavy and has to be protected from moisture and pests. Beer in a sealed vessel is relatively stable for a few days and easier to transport and distribute. The temples could efficiently move large quantities of beer to work sites and distribute it to hundreds of workers without the logistical challenges of managing equivalent amounts of grain. This efficiency mattered because the Sumerian economy was growing. Cities were getting larger. Building projects were getting more ambitious. The ziggurat at Ur, which still stands today as ruins, required thousands of workers laboring for years. Managing that workforce meant feeding them, and the beer ration system was the logistic solution that made it possible. Think about the ziggurat for a moment. It's a massive, stepped pyramid made of mud bricks, millions of them. Each brick had to be made from mud and straw, shaped in molds, dried in the sun, transported to the construction site, and placed. This required unskilled laborers for most of the work, but also skilled masons, engineers who understood weight distribution, and administrators who coordinated everything. All of those people were paid in rations. The unskilled laborers got their 5.5 liters of beer plus some bread and oil. The skilled workers got more. The administrators got even more, plus extra perks. The whole project ran on beer, and when it was finished, the king could point to this massive structure and say, "I built this for the gods." But really, it was built by thousands of workers who showed up every day because they needed their beer to survive. Let's talk about health for a moment, because this is important. The beer provided calories and some nutrients, but it wasn't a complete diet. Workers also received rations of bread, oil, and sometimes onions or fish. The beer was the largest component, but it was part of a package. However, the nutritional value of the diet depended heavily on your status. Low-level workers probably suffered from nutritional deficiencies. Their diet was monotonous: barley beer, barley bread, little oil, maybe some fish or vegetables if they were lucky. Not much protein, not much variety. This would lead to problems over time: dental issues from the high-starch diet, nutritional deficiencies causing weakness and illness, shorter lifespans compared to the elite who ate meat, dairy, and a variety of produce. The beer itself, despite having some nutritional benefits, was hard on the digestive system when consumed in those quantities. The chunks of grain and sediment would cause stomach problems. The alcohol would damage the liver over time. Workers' bodies wore out not just from the labor, but from what they were paid to do the labor. And yet, people adapted. Humans are incredibly adaptable. Generation after generation grew up in this system, knowing nothing else. To them, this was normal. You worked, you got beer, you drank it, you worked again. The rhythm of life was dictated by the ration cycle, and most people probably didn't think too much about whether it was fair or whether there was an alternative. This was just how the world worked. But some people did question it. We know this because we have literature from ancient Mesopotamia that includes complaints about working conditions, about unfair treatment, about the hardships of labor. These texts are rare, and they're usually framed as petitions to the gods or the king rather than as direct criticism of the system. But they show that people weren't completely passive. They knew they were getting the short end of the stick. There's one text where a worker complains that his rations have been reduced, and he doesn't know why. He appeals to the sense of justice, arguing that he's worked faithfully and deserves fair treatment. The text doesn't tell us if he got what he wanted, but the fact that it exists shows that the concept of fairness existed, even if it wasn't always honored. Now, let's think about women in this system more carefully, because their position was particularly complex. Women could own property in Sumerian society. They could engage in business. Some women were quite wealthy and powerful, but working-class women, the ones in the textile workshops, the ones brewing beer, the ones married to laborers, had fewer options and less autonomy. A woman working in a temple workshop would receive her beer ration, but she might also have children to care for. Those children would get smaller rations, which might not be enough, so she'd have to make choices: trade some of her beer for other goods, send her children to work as soon as they were old enough, marry them off to secure alliances or extra resources. The system forced constant calculation and compromise, and if a woman's husband died, her situation became even more precarious. She might lose access to his rations. She might lose the house if it was tied to his employment. She'd have to find work herself or rely on family, which might or might not be available. The beer ration system provided a baseline of security, but it was fragile, especially for women. Some women became tavern keepers, which gave them more independence. They'd brew beer, run an establishment, and interact with customers. This was risky. Taverns could be rowdy places, and women running them could face harassment or violence, but it was also an opportunity to control their own economic lives in a way that working in a temple workshop wasn't. One famous piece of literature from Mesopotamia is the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in it there's a character named Suduri who's a tavern keeper. She's wise, independent, and serves beer to the hero. The story treats her with respect, which suggests that tavern keepers held a certain status in society. They were businesswomen in a world that didn't usually encourage women to be in business. But most women weren't tavern keepers. Most were trying to survive in a system that paid them less than men and offered them fewer opportunities. And the beer they received, while valuable, wasn't enough to change that fundamental inequality. Let me tell you about the logistics of beer distribution because it's actually fascinating. The temples had large storage facilities where the beer was kept in big pottery vessels called pithoi. These could hold hundreds of liters. When it was time to distribute rations, workers would line up at designated times and places. Administrators would check lists to confirm who was owed what, then the beer would be measured out. They used standardized measuring vessels. The Sumerians were obsessed with standardization. They wanted everything to be consistent and measurable. They developed units of measurement for length, weight, and volume. The 5.5-liter beer ration was based on a unit called a sila, which was about 1 liter. So workers received 5.5 sila of beer per day. The measuring was done carefully because both sides cared about accuracy. Workers wanted to make sure they weren't being cheated. Administrators wanted to make sure they weren't giving out more than they were supposed to. There are records of disputes over measurements, and there were officials whose job was to resolve these disputes. It was bureaucracy at its most detailed. And think about what this means for a moment. You've worked all day, you're exhausted. You line up with dozens or hundreds of other workers. You wait your turn. An administrator who probably sees you as just another number checks a list, confirms your name, and authorizes your payment. Someone dips a measuring vessel into a large container of beer and pours it into your container. You check to make sure you got the right amount. Then you go home. Tomorrow, you'll do it all again. This ritual, repeated every day, reinforced the power structure. You were dependent. You were monitored. You were given exactly what the system determined you deserved, no more and no less. And if you complained, there were hundreds of other people who needed work and would take your place. But there was also a sense of community in these moments. You weren't alone. Everyone around you was in the same situation. You'd chat with the person next to you in line. You'd share complaints or jokes. You'd build relationships. The beer ration system, despite being oppressive, also created social bonds among the workers. They were all in it together, and that solidarity sometimes translated into collective action. Let's talk about festivals, because they're important to understanding how this system worked on a psychological level. The Sumerians had numerous religious festivals throughout the year. During these festivals, the normal rules were sometimes suspended. There would be extra rations, higher quality beer, special foods, entertainment. These festivals served as pressure release valves. People working under difficult conditions need to feel like there are rewards, moments of joy, something to look forward to. The festivals provided that. They also reinforced religious and political authority. The king or the temple priests would organize these events, demonstrating their power and generosity. The workers would participate, feeling grateful for the extra rations, even though those rations came from their own labor in the first place. It's a clever bit of social engineering. You create a system that's just bearable enough that people don't revolt. Then you add occasional moments of relief that make people feel fortunate. They compare their lives not to what they could have in a different system, but to their everyday experience versus the festival experience. And the festival experience makes the everyday experience seem more tolerable. During these festivals, there would be processions, music, dancing. The statues of gods would be paraded through the streets. There would be ritual dramas reenacting myths, and there would be copious amounts of beer. People would drink, celebrate, and for a few days forget their grievances. Then the festival would end, and everyone would go back to work. This pattern, work, suffer, celebrate, repeat, has been used by authorities throughout history. The Romans had bread and circuses. Medieval Europe had saints' days and feast days. Modern societies have weekends and holidays. The Sumerians were among the first to formalize this pattern, and it worked because it addressed a basic human need for variety and joy while keeping the fundamental power structure intact. Now, let's think about what happened to this system over time. The Sumerian civilization eventually declined. They were conquered by the Akkadians, then later the Babylonians, then the Assyrians. Each of these civilizations inherited aspects of Sumerian culture, including the beer ration system. The practice of paying workers in beer continued for thousands of years in Mesopotamia, but it also spread. As trade networks expanded, the idea of standardized rations for workers spread to other cultures. The Egyptians paid workers building the pyramids in beer and bread. The Hittites in Anatolia had similar systems. The concept proved to be durable because it solved real problems. How do you manage a large workforce in a pre-monetary economy? How do you ensure people have enough to survive without giving them so much that they become independent? The beer ration system was eventually replaced by monetary wages as coins became more common and economies became more complex. But the transition took centuries, and in some places, ration-based payment continued even after money was available. Old systems persist because people are used to them, because they serve the interests of the powerful, and because changing them requires effort and risk. Think about that for a second. A system invented 5,000 years ago to control workers lasted for millennia because it worked. Not for the workers necessarily, but for the people running things. And when we look at modern labor practices, we can see echoes of the same principles. Pay people enough to keep them working, but not enough to give them real freedom. Create dependency. Monitor everything. Standardize processes. It's all still there, just with different mechanisms. Let me tell you about one specific worker whose name has come down to us. In the administrative records from the city of Lagash, there's a man listed as Lu-Nanna. He was a laborer who worked on canal maintenance. We don't know much about him, but we know he received his beer rations regularly for at least several months because his name appears in multiple tablets. Lu-Nanna probably woke up before dawn every day. He probably had a family. The records mention rations for his household, which suggests a wife and possibly children. He worked in the hot sun, moving earth and water, maintaining the infrastructure that kept his city
city alive. He received his 5.5 liters of beer plus some bread and oil, and then one month his name stops appearing in the records. We don't know what happened to him. Maybe he died. Maybe he moved to another city. Maybe he became sick and couldn't work anymore. The records don't care about individuals beyond their utility. Lu-Nanna was useful while he worked, and when he stopped working, he became irrelevant to the scribes keeping track of rations. His life, his hopes, his thoughts, none of that was worth recording. Only his labor and his payment. That's what the beer ration system was really about. It reduced people to units of labor. You were valuable as long as you could work, and your value was measured in liters of beer. The system didn't see you as a person with dreams and aspirations. It saw you as a tool that needed fuel to function, and the beer was the fuel.
But Lu-Nanna was a person. He had thoughts and feelings. He probably loved his family. Maybe he enjoyed some aspects of his work, the camaraderie with other workers, the satisfaction of completing a difficult task. Maybe he had hobbies or interests. Maybe he told stories to his children at night. We'll never know. The system didn't care about any of that, so it wasn't preserved. Multiply Lu-Nanna by thousands, by tens of thousands, and you get a sense of the scale of the beer ration system. Entire cities full of people, all working, all receiving their rations, all living lives that were shaped by this economic structure. Each one was an individual with their own story, but the system treated them as interchangeable parts. And here's the thing that really gets me. The people running this system, the temple administrators, the palace officials, the scribes, they weren't villains. They weren't sitting around thinking about how to oppress people. They were just managing a society the best way they knew how. They had real problems to solve. How do you feed thousands of people? How do you organize labor for massive projects? How do you maintain order and stability? The beer ration system was their solution, and from their perspective, it worked. Cities functioned. Buildings got built. Fields got irrigated. Society continued. The fact that the system was oppressive to the workers was, to them, an unfortunate but acceptable cost. The priorities were order, efficiency, and the continuation of their way of life. Individual suffering was regrettable, but not important enough to change the system. This is how most oppressive systems work. They're not maintained by people who think of themselves as cruel. They're maintained by people who think they're doing what's necessary. They've convinced themselves that the current arrangement is natural, inevitable, or the best option available, and they benefit from the system, which makes it hard for them to see its flaws. The Sumerian elite lived very differently from Lu-Nanna. They had large houses with multiple rooms, decorated with art and furnished with comfortable furniture. They ate meat, dairy, fruits, and vegetables. They drank high-quality beer and wine. They wore fine clothes. They had servants. They didn't do hard physical labor. And they convinced themselves that this inequality was justified because they managed the system. They performed important religious rituals. They made decisions. In their minds, they earned their privileges. The workers were workers because that's what they were suited for. The elite were elite because they had special qualities: education, divine favor, noble birth. The system was fair because everyone had their place, and that place was determined by natural law or divine will. It was circular reasoning, but it was comfortable reasoning, and it allowed them to sleep at night despite the suffering they oversaw. Now, I want to talk about something that's often overlooked. Not everyone in this system was miserable all the time. Humans are resilient. People find joy even in difficult circumstances. Workers would have had friendships, romances, moments of laughter, small pleasures. The beer itself, despite being payment in a form of control, was also something people enjoyed. After a long day of work, sitting down with your beer, feeling the warmth spread through your body, the slight buzz taking the edge off your aches, that was real. It was a moment of relief. And people shared their beer with friends and family. They socialized over it. They made memories. There were probably workers who took pride in their skills. A mason who could lay bricks perfectly straight, a canal digger who understood water flow and could make crucial adjustments, a brewery worker who knew exactly when the fermentation was right. These people had expertise, even if the system didn't value them appropriately. And that expertise gave them dignity, at least in their own eyes and in the eyes of their peers. Children grew up in this world and found ways to be children. They played games in the streets between the mud brick houses. They swam in the canals when the overseers weren't looking. They helped their parents with small tasks and felt proud when they were old enough to receive their own rations, even if those rations were small. Growing up in an oppressive system doesn't mean your childhood is completely joyless. It just means the boundaries of your imagination are shaped by what you've experienced.
And there was music. The Sumerians had instruments, lyres, harps, drums, flutes. People sang while they worked. They sang at home. They sang at taverns. Music was a way to express feelings that couldn't be safely expressed in words. A song could carry sadness, anger, longing, joy. It could bind people together. It could make the work go faster. It could make life bearable. So when we talk about the beer ration system, we need to hold two truths at the same time. It was oppressive and exploitative, and people living within it still managed to be human, to find meaning, to care for each other. The system shaped their lives, but it didn't completely define them. They were more than their rations, even if the records only remember them that way. Let's talk about trade, because it's important to understand that Sumer wasn't isolated. They traded extensively with other regions. They imported wood from Lebanon, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. They exported textiles, grain, and beer. And that trade was built on the labor of workers paid in beer rations. The merchant class in Sumer was small but influential. These people didn't work with their hands. They organized caravans, negotiated deals, transported goods. They were paid differently, not in daily beer rations, but in shares of profit, in goods they could trade, in privileges granted by the palace or temple. They existed in a different economic world than the laborers. But the merchants depended on the laborers. The textiles they exported were made by women in workshops who received beer rations. The grain they traded was grown and harvested by farmers who received rations. The infrastructure that made trade possible, the roads, the boats, the irrigation systems, was built and maintained by ration workers. The entire economy rested on that foundation. And when you bought Sumerian textiles in a foreign market, you weren't thinking about the women who made them. You weren't thinking about their beer rations or their working conditions. You just saw a product, a piece of cloth. The labor that created it was invisible to you. This invisibility of labor is something we still experience today. We buy products without thinking about who made them or under what conditions. The merchants who grew wealthy from this trade probably told themselves they were creating prosperity. And in a way they were. Trade made Sumerian cities wealthier. It brought in resources that couldn't be produced locally. It created jobs, but the wealth was distributed unequally. And the people doing the actual work saw very little of it. They got their 5.5 liters of beer, and the profit went elsewhere.
There's a Sumerian proverb that says, "The merchant has a strong neck." It's a saying about how merchants carry heavy loads of goods, but it's also possibly a comment on how they shoulder responsibility and risk. But you know what? The workers carrying actual physical loads all day had strong necks too. They just didn't get proverbs written about them. Now, let's talk about what happened when harvests failed, because they did. Mesopotamian agriculture was productive, but it was also precarious. Too much flooding could destroy crops. Too little flooding meant not enough water for irrigation. Locusts could devastate fields. Plant diseases could spread. And when the harvest failed, the beer ration system started to collapse. The temples and palaces kept reserves of grain specifically for this reason. They'd store surplus from good years to cover bad years. But if there were multiple bad years in a row, those reserves would run out. And then decisions had to be made. Who gets fed? Who gets their full rations? Who gets reduced rations or nothing at all? The elite protected themselves first, obviously. They weren't going to starve while workers ate. The most essential workers, the ones maintaining irrigation systems, the ones protecting the city, they'd get priority. Everyone else had to make do with less or find other ways to survive. This might mean eating less, which led to malnutrition and disease. It might mean taking on debt, which could lead to debt slavery. It might mean stealing, which could lead to punishment or death. Famine created desperation, and desperation led to social instability. There are records of food riots in ancient Mesopotamia, people storming granaries, attacking officials. The rulers would respond with force when necessary, but they also knew that pushing people too far was dangerous. If the workers revolted en masse, the elite were outnumbered. The system only worked if people accepted it, even if grudgingly. So during famines, the rulers would sometimes try to provide at least minimal rations to prevent complete social breakdown. They'd cut their own consumption, at least symbolically. They'd organize public rituals, asking the gods to restore prosperity. They'd promise that things would get better. And usually, eventually, they did. The next harvest would be decent, the rations would return to normal, and people would go back to work. But the trauma of famine lingered. People remembered what it felt like to be hungry. They remembered watching their children suffer. They remembered the fear. And that
memory made them more compliant in good times. Better to accept your 5.5 liters of beer and not make trouble than risk losing even that. Fear is a powerful tool for social control, and the Sumerian elite understood this, whether consciously or instinctively. You don't need to actively terrorize people if they're already afraid. You just need to create a system where security is conditional on obedience and where the alternative to obedience is genuinely frightening. Let's talk about beer quality again, because it varied so much, and that variation reinforced social hierarchy. The best beer was clear, relatively smooth, with a pleasant taste and consistent alcohol content. This was made carefully with good ingredients and filtered properly. This beer went to the elite. The beer for workers was made as cheaply and efficiently as possible. Ingredients that were slightly off, fermentation that wasn't carefully controlled, minimal filtering. It probably tasted sour, harsh, inconsistent. Some batches might have been almost undrinkable, but you drank it anyway because it was your payment. Complaining might get you nothing at all. Imagine drinking something every day that you don't really enjoy, that sometimes makes you feel sick, but that you need to survive. That's psychological as well as physical oppression. It's a constant reminder that your needs matter less than efficiency and cost savings. You're worth feeding, but you're not worth feeding well. And the workers knew the good beer existed. They saw it at festivals. They heard about it. Some of them probably had tasted it on special occasions. They knew what they were missing. That knowledge created resentment, but it also created aspiration. If you could somehow move up in status, maybe become a skilled worker, maybe a low-level administrator, you'd get better beer. The system dangled that possibility in front of people, even though very few could actually achieve it.
This is another form of control. Give people a tiny chance of advancement, and they'll focus their energy on trying to achieve that, rather than on questioning the system itself. It's easier psychologically to think, maybe someday I'll get better beer, than to think this entire system is unjust. Hope, even false hope, is more comfortable than despair. Now, let's talk about the scribes, because they're fascinating. These were the people who kept all those records. Who got what, when, how much. Being a scribe required education, which was rare. You had to learn cuneiform, which was complex. You had to learn mathematics. You had to be reliable and careful because mistakes in the records could cause serious problems. Scribes were paid better than laborers, but they weren't at the top of the hierarchy. They served the elite. They were educated enough to understand how the system worked, which meant they could see its injustices, but they were also dependent on that system for their livelihood. If they criticized too loudly, they'd lose their positions. Some scribes probably rationalized their role. They were just recording facts. They weren't making the decisions about who got what. They were neutral observers. But of course, they weren't neutral. By maintaining the records that made the system function, they were essential to its continuation. Without scribes, the beer ration system couldn't have operated at the scale it did. Other scribes might have felt genuine sympathy for the workers they documented. They saw the numbers. They knew how little people received. But what could they do? They had families to feed. They had their own rations to think about. And individual scribes couldn't change the system even if they wanted to. So they did their jobs, and maybe they felt guilty, and maybe they didn't. One thing we know about some scribes is that they made jokes. There are tablets with humorous comments, puns, little drawings in the margins. These people were human. They got bored. They found ways to make their work more interesting. Some of those jokes might have been at the expense of the workers they were documenting, which is dark. Some might have been about the administrators they worked for, which was risky but probably satisfying. The scribal schools where young scribes were trained were tough. Students had to copy texts over and over to learn cuneiform. They had to memorize word lists and mathematical tables. There was physical punishment for mistakes. It was education, but it was also indoctrination into the bureaucratic mindset. You learned to value precision, hierarchy, and obedience to authority. And yet, some of the most interesting Sumerian literature was written by scribes who used their education to create something beyond bureaucracy. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Hymn to Ninkasi, love poems, wisdom literature. These were created by people who had been trained as bureaucrats, but who had imagination and creativity that transcended their training. They understood the system from inside, and sometimes they critiqued it in subtle ways through their art. There's a Sumerian proverb that says, "A scribe who does not know Sumerian, what kind of scribe is he?" It's about professional competence, but it's also about identity. The scribes saw themselves as preservers of culture, not just as record keepers. They were proud of their skills, and that pride might have made it easier to ignore the ethical implications of what they were doing. Let's shift to talk about the physical spaces where all this happened. The cities of Sumer were walled with narrow streets between buildings. The workers lived in small houses, often single-room structures where the whole family
family slept, ate, and lived. Privacy was almost non-existent. You could hear your neighbors through the walls. You knew everyone's business. The work sites were varied. Some workers spent their days in workshops inside the city. Others worked in the fields outside the walls. Canal maintenance meant traveling to wherever repairs were needed. Building projects meant going to the construction site, which could be anywhere from the center of the city to its outskirts. The temples and palaces dominated the cityscape. They were the largest, most impressive buildings, designed to inspire awe. When you looked at them, you were supposed to feel small, to feel the power of the gods and the king. And it worked, probably. These buildings were genuinely impressive, and they represented something beyond everyday life. They were permanent in a way that workers' houses weren't.
But those impressive buildings were constructed by workers paid in beer rations. Every brick, every decorative element, every massive platform was the result of human labor that was compensated minimally. The beauty and majesty of Sumerian architecture came at a cost, and that cost was paid by people whose names we mostly don't know. Inside the temples, there were storage rooms filled with jars of beer, sacks of grain, vessels of oil. There were workshops where women wove textiles. There were kitchens where food was prepared for offerings to the gods. There were administrative offices where scribes worked on their tablets. The temples were economic centers disguised as religious ones, or maybe religious centers that had economic functions. The line was blurry. The palace was similar, but focused on secular power rather than religious authority. The king and his family lived in luxury that was unimaginable to ordinary workers. Multiple rooms with decorated walls, furniture, abundant food, servants attending to every need. The king was supposed to be the intermediary between the gods and the people, chosen to rule because of divine favor. But the king's power rested on the labor of the people paid in beer rations. Without them, there was no surplus to support the palace. Without them, there were no impressive building projects to demonstrate the king's greatness. Without them, there was no army to defend the city or attack neighbors. The king needed the workers, even if he didn't acknowledge that dependency in any meaningful way. When a new king came to power, sometimes there would be a period of uncertainty. Would the new king honor the old arrangements? Would rations continue? Workers would wait nervously to find out. Usually, things continued more or less as before because changing the system was difficult and risky. But there was always that moment of vulnerability when anything could happen. Some kings positioned themselves as reformers. They'd cancel debts, increase rations, reduce corvée labor requirements, forced labor that citizens had to perform for the state. These reforms were popular, obviously, and they made the king look benevolent. But the reforms often didn't last. The economic pressures that created the conditions in the first place would reassert themselves, and gradually things would slide back to how they were. There's a famous reform document from the city of Lagash, created by a ruler named Urakagana around 2350 BCE. He claimed to reduce oppressive practices, protect widows and orphans, and restore justice. It's presented as a moral awakening, a return to proper values. But reading between the lines, it seems like things had gotten so bad that reforms were necessary to prevent rebellion. And we don't actually know how thoroughly these reforms were implemented or how long they lasted. This pattern of oppression, reform, gradual return to oppression has repeated throughout history. Systems that concentrate power and resources tend toward exploitation. Reforms happen when the exploitation becomes unsustainable, but they're usually limited and temporary. The fundamental structure remains unchanged. The Sumerian beer ration system existed for centuries, despite various reform efforts, because it served the interests of the people in power too well to abandon completely. Now let's talk about what happened at the end of someone's working life. There was no retirement in the way we understand it. If you couldn't work anymore due to age or injury, your rations stopped. You were dependent on family to take care of you, if you had family. If you didn't, your options were begging or starving. This created strong incentives to have children. Children were your retirement plan. You raised them, you trained them to work, and hopefully they'd take care of you when you were old. But this meant having children was an economic necessity, not just a personal choice. And it meant children felt obligated to care for aging parents, which was a burden on young families who were already struggling. Some temples and palaces provided minimal support for aged workers who had served faithfully for many years. But this was exceptional, not standard. Most people had to rely on family or community charity, and if the community was struggling, that charity might not be available. The
average lifespan was much shorter than today. Many people died young from disease, accidents, or complications from malnutrition. Those who lived to what we'd consider old age, maybe their 50s or 60s, had survived a lot. They'd outlived many of their peers, but they'd also accumulated decades of physical damage from hard labor and poor nutrition. Their bodies were worn out.
And when they died, there were burial practices to consider. The Sumerians buried their dead with some grave goods, pottery, tools, sometimes food and drink for the afterlife. Even workers got this treatment, though obviously on a much more modest scale than the elite, but it shows that death was seen as a transition, not an ending, and that people deserved some dignity even after their usefulness as workers had ended. Graves of workers have been excavated, and they tell us things. The skeletons show signs of hard labor, bone stress, injuries, arthritis at young ages. Teeth are often worn down or damaged. There's evidence of nutritional deficiencies. These people's bodies record the story of their lives more honestly than any written document. One thing that strikes me is that we excavate these graves, we study these bones, we write papers about nutrition and labor patterns, and we call it archaeology. But these were people. They loved, they suffered, they hoped, they feared. They had inner lives that are completely inaccessible to us now. We can measure their bones, but we can't know their thoughts. And that gap between what we can know and who they actually were is haunting. Let's talk about religion from the worker's perspective because it mattered. The gods were real to these people. The rituals weren't just empty ceremonies. When things went well, it was because the gods were pleased. When things went badly, it was because the gods were angry or because demons were causing trouble. Religion explained the world, and the priests told them that the work they did was service to the gods. When you dug a canal, you weren't just making agriculture possible, you were fulfilling divine will. The gods wanted the fields irrigated. The gods wanted the temples built. Your suffering had meaning because it was part of a cosmic order. This belief probably made life more bearable. If your work was meaningless, if your suffering had no purpose, that's despair. But if you believed that your labor pleased the gods, that you were contributing to something sacred, that brought comfort. It gave dignity to work that might otherwise seem degrading. But it also made challenging the system harder. If the social order was divinely ordained, questioning it was sacrilege. If the king ruled by divine right, opposing him was opposing the gods. If your poverty was part of the gods' plan, trying to change it was futile. Religion provided meaning, but it also provided justification for inequality. The festivals and rituals created moments where workers felt connected to something larger than their daily struggle. Watching a procession of priests carrying the statue of a god, participating in communal hymns, receiving blessed food and drink, these were powerful experiences. They created a sense of community and belonging that transcended individual hardship. And yet, we have texts that suggest some people questioned religious explanations. The Sumerian Job is a poem about a righteous man who suffers despite his piety. He questions why the gods allow this. Eventually, he's restored to prosperity, and the poem's message is that we can't understand divine will, but we should maintain faith. But the fact that the question was asked, why do good people suffer, shows that people grappled with these issues. Some workers probably believed deeply. Some probably went through the motions without much conviction. Some probably had complex, contradictory feelings. Just like people today, they contained multitudes. They weren't simple or uniform in their beliefs, but religion was unavoidable. It was woven into every aspect of life. You couldn't opt out. Now, let's think about resistance and rebellion. Because it happened. Not constantly, not on a massive scale, but people resisted in small and large ways, doing poor quality work, stealing supplies, spreading rumors about officials. These were minor acts, but they were acts of resistance nonetheless. More organized resistance took the form of strikes, which we talked about earlier. Workers would collectively refuse to work until their grievances were addressed. This required coordination and courage. If you struck and the authorities decided to crack down, you could be punished severely. But if enough workers struck together, they had leverage. There were also instances of workers fleeing. If conditions became unbearable, some people would leave the city and try to survive elsewhere. This was risky because you were leaving the only support system you knew. But it was an option, and some people took it. The authorities didn't like this because they needed workers. There are records of efforts to track down and return people who fled. Armed rebellion was rare but not unheard of. If conditions deteriorated enough, if leadership was weak enough, workers and lower-class people might try to overthrow the existing order. These rebellions were usually suppressed, often brutally, but the the threat of rebellion forced the elite to consider how far they could push people before things exploded.
The elite lived in constant, low-level fear of the masses. They were outnumbered. They knew that their lifestyle depended on the cooperation, however coerced, of people who had every reason to resent them. So they used a combination of ideological control, religion, tradition, claims of natural superiority, economic control, the ration system that created dependency, and when necessary, violence to maintain their position. But here's something interesting. Some members of the elite probably felt guilty, not enough to give up their privileges, but enough to be troubled by the inequality. They might have been generous to individual workers. They might have supported reforms. They might have called themselves that they were doing the best they could within an imperfect system. Humans are good at justifying their positions to themselves. And some workers probably didn't resent the elite as much as we might expect. If you grow up in a hierarchical system, you internalize it to some degree. The elite seem naturally superior. Your place seems natural and inevitable. It takes a certain kind of imagination and courage to envision a different way of organizing society. Most people, most of the time, accept what they know because questioning it is psychologically difficult and practically dangerous. But the resentment was there, simmering. It shows up in the records of labor disputes. It shows up in the need for reforms. It shows up in the literature that portrays workers sympathetically. The elite couldn't completely ignore the humanity and the grievances of the people they depended on. They had to manage those grievances, contain them, occasionally address them, even if they never fundamentally changed the system. Let me tell you about the children in this system because their experience was particularly poignant. Children growing up in workers' families learned what life was about very young. They learned that work was unavoidable. They learned that authority should be obeyed. They learned that some people had more and some people had less. And this was just how things were. They started contributing to household labor as soon as they were able. Small children could help with simple tasks. Older children could do more significant work. By the time they were teenagers, they were often working full-time or close to it. Childhood as a protected period of education and play didn't really exist for most people. But children still played. They invented games. They found moments of fun. Human children are resilient and creative. Even in difficult circumstances, they find ways to be children. The difference is that their play was constrained by their reality. They played at being workers, probably because that's what they saw and what they knew their future held. Education was limited. The scribble schools existed, but they were for children of the elite or for promising children who might serve the elite. Most workers' children learn from their parents how to do the family trade, how to survive, how to navigate the social world they inhabited. That education was practical and limited, but it was what they needed for the lives they would lead. Some children probably dreamed of different lives. Maybe they heard stories about heroes and gods and imagined being powerful or free. But most likely they learned to curtail those dreams early. Accepting your lot in life was a survival strategy. Hope could be painful when it was constantly disappointed. Better to lower your expectations and find contentment in small things. And yet parents loved their children. They wanted better for them, even if better was only marginally better. A father might hope his son could become a skilled craftsman instead of an unskilled laborer. A mother might hope her daughter could marry someone with slightly more resources. These modest aspirations were still aspirations. They still represented care and hope.
Parents made sacrifices for their children. They gave them their own food when there wasn't enough. They tried to protect them from the worst aspects of life. They told them stories and sang them songs. They provided what comfort they could. Love existed in these families, even if love couldn't change the fundamental material conditions they lived in. Now, let's talk about the calculations that workers had to make, because life in this system required constant calculation. How much beer could you drink before you'd be too impaired to work the next day? How much could you trade for other goods without leaving yourself short? How much could you save, even though beer spoiled, by trading it for something more durable? You had to calculate social relationships too. Who could you trust? Who might help you in hard times? Who might betray you to gain favor with authorities? Building a network of supportive relationships was essential for survival, but it also required vulnerability. You had to trust people enough to ask for help, but not trust them so much that you'd be destroyed if they let you down. And you had to calculate how much to push back against injustice. If you were shorted on your rations, do you complain? If you do and you're right, maybe you get what you're owed. But if you complain too much, you get marked as a troublemaker. You have to pick your battles. You have to know when to stand up for yourself and when to accept being cheated, because fighting would cost you more. These calculations were exhausting. The mental and emotional labor of navigating an oppressive system while trying to survive and maintain some dignity, that takes a toll. It's stress that accumulates over time. It contributes to health problems. It shortens lives. The beer ration system didn't just extract physical labor, it extracted mental and emotional energy too. And you could never fully relax. Even when you weren't working, you were thinking about work, planning for the next day, worrying about whether the rations would come, dealing with the consequences of the previous day's labor, exhaustion, injuries, illness. Your entire life was structured around work and survival. There was little space left for anything else. Some people found that space. Anyway, they carved out moments for art, for music, for storytelling, for love, for spirituality. Humans need more than just survival. We need meaning and beauty and connection. So people created those things in whatever ways they could with whatever resources they had. A song at the end of the day, a story told to children, a moment of laughter with friends. These things mattered. But the system wasn't designed to give people space for those things. They happened in spite of the system, not because of it. And that's important to remember. When we talk about ancient civilizations and their achievements, we're often talking about things that were built on the backs of people who had very little space for their own flourishing. The great temples and the beautiful art came at a cost. Let me tell you about a specific type of worker, the water carriers. In a hot, dry climate, water was essential on work sites. Someone had to bring water to the workers throughout the day. This was often done by young people or by workers who were injured or ill and couldn't do heavier work. It was exhausting carrying heavy vessels of water all day in the heat, but it was necessary. Water carriers received rations like everyone else, but they were sometimes looked down on because the work was considered unskilled. And yet without them, the other workers couldn't function. They were essential but undervalued. This is a pattern we see throughout history and still today. The most essential work is often the least respected and least compensated.
The water carriers would make trip after trip from the water source to the work site. They'd see the progress of the construction or the canal digging. They'd hear the workers talk. They'd be present but peripheral. And at the end of the day, they'd get their beer rations and go home, probably with aching backs and shoulders. Did they take pride in their work? Maybe. They were keeping people alive and helping projects get completed. Or maybe they resented it, wished they could do something different, felt invisible and unappreciated. Probably some combination, depending on the day and the person. The point is, even within the category of workers paid in beer rations, there was diversity of experience and status. The system wasn't monolithic. It was complex, with hierarchies and variations and individual circumstances that shaped how people experienced it. But the fundamental structure, work for rations, rations that kept you dependent but never free, that was consistent. Let's talk about the temple's economic power more directly. These institutions owned vast amounts of land. In some city-states, the temple owned up to a third of all agricultural land. That land was worked by people receiving rations. The produce from that land went to the temple. The temple then distributed it as rations, sold it for profit, or used it for religious ceremonies. This made the temples incredibly wealthy. They accumulated surplus that could be used for emergencies, for trade, for building projects, for supporting the priestly class in comfort. The temples were theoretically serving the gods, but practically they were economic engines that enriched the institution and the people who controlled it. The head priests were powerful figures. They managed enormous resources. They employed hundreds or thousands of people. They negotiated with the palace, with other temples, with merchants. They made decisions that affected entire populations, and they lived very well, justified by the importance of their religious role. Some priests probably took their religious responsibilities seriously. They believed they were serving the gods in the community. Others were probably more cynical, enjoying the power and wealth while going through the religious motions. Most likely, individual priests varied in their sincerity and their motivations, just like people in power always do. But from the workers' perspective, it didn't matter much whether the priests were sincere or cynical. What mattered was that the temple controlled your livelihood. The temple decided if you worked and what you received. The temple could help you in crisis or abandon you. The temple's power over your life was real, regardless of the priest's internal states. And the temples reinforced their power through ritual and through architecture. The religious ceremonies created a sense of the sacred that made the temple's authority seem natural and inevitable. The massive buildings inspired awe and demonstrated the temple's permanence and importance. Everything about the temple was designed to make you
feel that this institution was central, powerful, and worthy of your labor and loyalty. But here's a fascinating thing. Despite all this power and control, the temples needed the workers. If workers stopped working, the whole system collapsed. The temples couldn't function without the laborers they paid in beer. So there was mutual dependency, even if it was extremely unequal. The workers needed the rations to survive. The temples needed the workers to maintain their power and wealth. This mutual dependence is why the system had to be managed carefully. Push workers too hard, and they might rebel or flee. Give them too much, and they might become independent. The sweet spot from the temple's perspective was keeping people productive but dependent. And the beer ration system, for all its complexity and variation, achieved that balance reasonably well for a very long time. Now, let's think about innovation. Did anyone try to improve this system? Were there experiments with different forms of payment or organization? The honest answer is, we don't know for sure, but probably not much. Systems that work, from the perspective of those in power, tend not to be experimented with. And the beer ration system worked for the elite.
There were variations over time and between cities. Some places might have had slightly higher rations or better quality beer. Some might have had more flexible arrangements. But the basic structure remained. You worked, you got rations, the rations kept you dependent. That core idea persisted because it served its purpose. Innovation in ancient Mesopotamia happened in other areas. They invented the wheel. They developed advanced mathematics. They created sophisticated irrigation systems. They invented writing. All of these innovations required intellectual energy and creativity. But that energy wasn't directed at fundamentally rethinking how labor was organized and compensated. Maybe that's because the people with the education and leisure to innovate were the same people benefiting from the existing system. This is a common pattern. Innovation happens in areas that serve the interests of the powerful or that don't threaten existing power structures. Innovation that would redistribute power or wealth is much rarer because it requires people to work against their own interests, or it requires pressure from below that forces change. The workers probably had ideas about how things could be better, but they didn't have the power to implement those ideas, and they likely didn't have the education or the platform to even articulate them in ways that would be recorded and remembered. Their voices are mostly lost to history. We hear about them through the records of the people who controlled them, which means we're getting a very filtered and biased version of their experience. Let me shift gears and talk about specific cities, because they had different characters. Uruk was one of the largest and most important cities in early Sumer. At its peak, it might have had 50,000 people living in it, which was enormous for the time. Managing that population required sophisticated logistics. The beer ration system was essential to keeping Uruk functioning. Another major city, was a center of trade. It had access to the Persian Gulf and engaged in long-distance commerce. The workers in weren't just building temples and digging canals. Some were loading and unloading ships, building boats, processing imported goods, but they were still paid in beer rations. The work was different, but the compensation system was the same. Lagash was known for its agricultural productivity and its extensive irrigation systems. Workers there spent much of their time maintaining canals and working fields. The administration in Lagash seems to have been particularly bureaucratic and thorough, based on the number of administrative tablets that have survived. Every detail was recorded, every transaction documented. Each city had its own patron god. In Uruk, it was Inanna, the goddess of love and war. In it was Nanna, the moon god. In Lagash, it was Mingirsu, a god of agriculture and war. The identity of the city was tied to its god, and the temple of that god was the symbolic and economic heart of the city. Workers weren't just working for themselves or even for human employers. They were working for the god, or so they were told. This religious dimension added another layer to the beer ration system. Your rations were, in a sense, gifts from the god, distributed through the temple. Being grateful for your rations was being grateful to the god. Complaining about your rations was potentially ungrateful to the god. Religion and economics were so intertwined that separating them is difficult. Now let's talk about the later history of beer as payment. As I mentioned, this system lasted for millennia in Mesopotamia. When the Akkadians conquered Sumer around 2334 BCE under Sargon of Akkad, they adopted many Sumerian practices, including beer rations for workers. When the third dynasty of established a new Sumerian renaissance around 2100 BCE, the beer ration system was still central. The Code of Hammurabi from the Old Babylonian period around 1750 BCE includes laws about beer and taverns, showing that beer remained economically and socially important. The Hittites in Anatolia, the Egyptians, other cultures in the region, they all used beer as payment and sustenance for workers. The idea spread and persisted. Eventually, as metallic currency became more common and economies became more complex, pure ration systems declined.
People started receiving a combination of rations and money, then mostly money with some rations, then just money. But this transition took centuries, and it was uneven.
uneven. In some places and for some types of work, ration payment continued long after money was available elsewhere. The beer ration system's legacy, though, extends beyond ancient Mesopotamia. The idea that workers should receive standardized compensation based on their labor became foundational to economic thinking. The bureaucratic apparatus needed to manage that system, record-keeping, measurement standards, hierarchical administration. These are things we still use today. Modern payroll systems are direct descendants of Sumerian ration management, even though the medium of payment has changed. And the fundamental relationship this system created, workers dependent on employers for survival, exchanging labor for the means to live, but never accumulating enough to become free. That relationship still exists. We call it wage labor now instead of ration labor. We get paid in money instead of beer. But the underlying structure is remarkably similar. You work, you get paid enough to survive and come back tomorrow, but usually not enough to escape the need to work. I'm not saying modern wage labor and ancient ration systems are identical. There are important differences. We have more legal protections. We have more mobility. We have more options. But the basic exchange, your time and energy for the resources you need to survive, that hasn't fundamentally changed in 5,000 years. And the power imbalance. Employers have more power than individual workers. That's still with us too. The Sumerians didn't invent this power imbalance. It probably emerged gradually as societies became more complex and stratified. But they formalized it. They systematized it. They made it efficient and sustainable. And in doing so, they created a template that has been adapted and reused throughout human history. Let's talk about what happened when Sumerian civilization declined. The cities didn't just disappear. They were conquered, abandoned, sometimes rebuilt by later civilizations. But the people, the workers who had been paid in beer for generations, what happened to them? Some probably stayed in place and adapted to new rulers. The Akkadians, the Babylonians, whoever controlled the region would need workers. The system would continue with minor variations. Some probably fled to other regions, becoming refugees or migrants, carrying their skills and knowledge with them. Some probably died in the conflicts that accompanied political transitions. And gradually, the cuneiform script stopped being used. The language stopped being spoken. The gods stopped being worshipped, replaced by other gods and eventually by monotheistic religions. The beer ration system evolved into other forms of compensation. The physical cities crumbled, their mud bricks dissolving back into the earth they came from. But for thousands of years, while it lasted, this was the world. For generations upon generations of people, the beer ration system was reality. It shaped their lives from birth to death. It determined what they could do, where they could go, how they could live. It was as real and solid to them as our economic system is to us. And like our system, it probably seemed permanent and natural to most people most of the time, even though it was a human creation that could have been different. The archaeological sites where Sumerian cities once stood are now in modern Iraq, a country that has experienced tremendous turmoil in recent decades. Wars, invasions, sanctions, instability, and in the midst of this modern suffering, the ancient ruins sit, testament to another era's suffering and achievement. The ziggurat at Ur still stands, partially reconstructed. You can visit it if it's safe to do so. You can walk where workers once carried bricks, fueled by their daily beer rations. And if you stand there and think about it, you might feel a connection across millennia. The basic human experiences, work, exhaustion, the need for food and drink, the desire for dignity and meaning, these haven't changed. The specifics of how we organize our societies and our economies change, but the underlying human needs and struggles remain constant. Let me tell you about one more aspect of this system, the measurement standards. The Sumerians developed standardized units of volume, which was essential for the beer ration system. A sela, as I mentioned, was about a liter. They had larger and smaller units too. These standards had to be maintained across the entire society. There were official measuring vessels that were used to ensure consistency.
This standardization was an achievement. It required agreement and enforcement. It required making and distributing standardized tools. It required training people to use them correctly. It required oversight to prevent cheating. All of this was necessary to make the beer ration system work at scale. And it's another example of how this economic system drove innovation and organization. The standardized measurements weren't just for beer. They were used for all kinds of goods. But beer was important enough that getting the measurements right mattered enormously. Shortchanging workers on their beer could cause serious problems, so the system had to be fair, or at least perceived as fair, even if the overall arrangement was exploitative. And this gets at something important. Oppressive systems can include elements of fairness and consistency. In fact, they often need to. If the system is completely arbitrary and capricious, people can't function within it. They can't plan or calculate or strategize. They're completely at the mercy of random chance and individual whims. That's actually harder to sustain than a system that's consistently unfair. Consistent unfairness creates stability, even if it's oppressive stability. The Sumerians understood this, whether consciously or not. They created a system that was exploitative but predictable. Workers knew what to expect. They knew what they'd receive if they did their work. That predictability made the system sustainable, and it probably made people feel like there was some justice in it, even if the fundamental arrangement was unjust. This gets at something important. Oppressive systems can include elements of fairness and consistency. In fact, they often need to. If the system is completely arbitrary and capricious, people can't function within it. They can't plan or calculate or strategize. They're completely at the mercy of random chance and individual whims. That's actually harder to sustain than a system that's consistently unfair. Consistent unfairness creates stability, even if it's oppressive stability. The Sumerians understood this, whether consciously or not. They created a system that was exploitative but predictable. Workers knew what to expect. They knew what they'd receive if they did their work. That predictability made the system sustainable, and it probably made people feel like there was some justice in it, even though the fundamental arrangement was unjust. This is why systemic injustice is often harder to fight than individual injustice. An individual being cruel or unfair is obviously wrong, but a system that treats everyone according to clear rules, even if those rules produce unjust outcomes, has a veneer of legitimacy. It seems fair because it's consistent, and fighting it requires questioning not just individual actions, but the entire structure of society, which is much more difficult. Now, I want to talk about something that's often overlooked, the sensory experience of this world. What did it smell like? The beer itself had a distinctive smell. Fermentation, yeast, barley. That smell would have been everywhere because beer was everywhere. In homes, in workshops, in taverns, at work sites. It was a constant olfactory reminder of the system you lived in. The city smelled like smoke from cooking fires and kilns. They smelled like human and animal waste because sanitation was limited. They smelled like sweat and dust in the river. These weren't pleasant smells by our standards, but they were normal to the people who lived there. They probably wouldn't have noticed them most of the time, any more than you notice the ambient smells of your own environment. What did it sound like? The workshops full of people weaving or making pottery, the construction sites with mallets striking wood and stone, the irrigation systems with water flowing through channels, the markets where people traded goods, the temples with priests chanting and people praying, the homes with children playing and families talking. It was a human soundscape full of labor and life. What did it feel like? The heat, which was oppressive much of the year, the coolness of the thick mud brick walls inside buildings, the texture of clay tablets under a scribe's stylus, the weight of a loaded carrying basket, the solidity of a brick in your hand, the wetness of mud used for construction, the smoothness of beer vessels. These tactile experiences shaped how people interacted with their world. And what did things taste like? The beer, obviously, which was a major part of the daily diet. Thick, grainy, sour, or sweet, depending on how it was made. Barley bread, which was dense and filling. Onions, which were a common food. Fish, when you could get it. Oil, usually sesame oil, used for cooking and as food. Most people's diets were limited and repetitive. Variety was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. These sensory experiences were the texture of life. They're almost impossible to fully recover or imagine, but they were real to the people who experienced them, and they were shaped by the economic system. The taste of your daily beer ration, the smell of the brewery, the sound of other workers around you. These were all part of what it meant to live in this system. Let me talk about one more group of people, the children of the elite. They grew up in the same cities as workers' children, but in a completely different world. They had abundant food, not just survival rations. They had education, learning to read and write and do mathematics. They had leisure time to play and explore. They had expectations of inheriting status and power.
Did they understand how different their lives were? Probably to some extent, but also probably not fully. When you grow up with privilege, it's hard to really comprehend what it's like without it. You might see workers and think, they have their place, and I have mine, and this is natural. You might even feel sorry for them in an abstract way, while still enjoying your own advantages and not questioning the system that produces those advantages. Some elite children probably grew up to be compassionate, trying to use their power to help where they could within the system. Others probably grew up to be callous, seeing workers as less than fully human. Most probably grew up to be something in between, capable of kindness and cruelty, of generosity and selfishness, shaped by their environment but still making individual choices. And some elite children probably rebelled against their expected roles. We don't have many records of this, but it must have happened. Someone who was supposed to inherit power deciding they didn't want it, or at least feeling conflicted about it. Someone using their education to critique the system rather than maintain it. These people probably existed, even if their stories weren't preserved. The children of both workers and elites eventually became adults and had children of their own, continuing the cycle. Generation after generation, the system reproduced itself. People were born into it, lived their lives within it, died, and the next generation took their place. This is how social systems persist, through this generational transmission of practices, beliefs, and structures. But systems do change eventually. Nothing human is truly permanent. The Sumerian civilization that invented the beer ration system eventually declined and was replaced by others. The specific practices evolved. The gods were forgotten. The cuneiform tablets stopped being readable for thousands of years until scholars figured out how to decipher them again in the 19th century. And now we look back at this system from 5,000 years later, trying to understand it, trying to learn from it. We excavate the ruins. We translate the text. We analyze the economic data. We try to imagine what it was like to be Lu-Nanna, receiving his 5.5 liters of beer each day, working in the hot sun, going home to his family, doing it all again the next day. What should we learn from this? I think several things. First, that economic systems are human creations, not natural laws. The beer ration system seemed permanent and natural to the people living in it, but it was designed by humans and could have been designed differently. The same is true of our own economic systems. Second, that the people in power will usually design systems that benefit themselves while presenting those systems as necessary, natural, or divinely ordained. The Sumerian elite convinced themselves and others that their privileges were justified. We should be skeptical when modern elites make similar claims. Third, that ordinary people are resilient and complex. The workers paid in beer rations weren't just victims. They were people who found meaning, created beauty, loved each other, and sometimes resisted oppression. They deserve to be remembered as fully human, not just as statistics or as labor units. Fourth, that systems of exploitation can be sophisticated and can include elements of fairness and protection while still being fundamentally unjust. The beer ration system kept people alive while keeping them trapped. That's more insidious than a system that's obviously cruel, because it's harder to recognize and resist. And fifth, that the basic structures of economic exploitation have been with us for a very long time. We've made progress in many ways. We have labor laws, safety regulations, minimum wages, workers' rights, but the fundamental exchange, your labor for the means to survive, controlled by others who extract value from that exchange, that's still how most of the world works. Understanding its ancient origins might help us think more clearly about whether and how to change it. The beer ration system of ancient Sumer is gone. The cities are ruins. The language is dead. The gods are forgotten. But the patterns it represents, hierarchy, dependency, exploitation combined with survival, sophisticated bureaucracy in service to inequality, these patterns are very much alive. They've been adapted and modified and dressed up in new language, but they're recognizable if you know what to look for.
And that's perhaps the most sobering lesson. 5,000 years of human civilization, 5,000 years of technological and social development, and we're still struggling with fundamentally the same issues of how to organize labor, how to distribute resources, how to balance power between those who work and those who control the work. We've gotten better in some ways, worse in others, but we haven't solved it. The workers of ancient Sumer would probably understand our world better than we might think. They'd recognize the basic structures, work for someone else, receive compensation that's less than the value you create, have limited power to change your circumstances. The details would be different and confusing. Money instead of beer, factories instead of fields, computers instead of clay tablets. But the basic experience of being a worker in a hierarchical economic system would be familiar. And maybe that should inspire us to think differently about our own systems. If we can recognize that the beer ration system was a human creation that served some interests while exploiting others, maybe we can recognize the same about our own economic arrangements. If we can feel empathy for Lu-Nanna working in the sun for his daily beer, maybe we can feel empathy for modern workers struggling in different but analogous ways. Let me talk about one final thing, the paradox of civilization. The Sumerian civilization created incredible things. things: writing, mathematics, literature, architecture, art, law codes, irrigation systems. These are genuine achievements that advanced human knowledge and capability. They created beauty and order where there had been less of both. But these achievements were built on exploitation. The temples and ziggurats that we marvel at as archaeological wonders were built by people who had little choice in the matter, who were paid just enough to survive, who lived difficult lives in service to others' ambitions. The scribes who created literature were part of a bureaucratic system that managed exploitation. The irrigation systems that were engineering marvels were maintained by people working for beer rations. So what do we make of this? Can we appreciate the achievements while acknowledging the cost? Should we? These aren't easy questions. The achievements were real. Human knowledge and capability did advance, but so was the suffering real. The cost was paid by real people with real lives that were constrained and difficult. I think we have to hold both truths at once. The Sumerian civilization was an achievement, and it was built on exploitation. Those facts don't cancel each other out. They coexist uncomfortably, and that discomfort is important. It should make us think about our own civilization, what we're building, what we're achieving, and who's paying the cost. Because we are building things. Modern civilization has incredible achievements, medical advances that extend and improve lives, technologies that connect us and expand our capabilities, art and culture that enrich human experience. These are real and valuable, but they're also built on systems of exploitation, supply chains that depend on poorly paid labor, environmental destruction that will be paid for by future generations, economic structures that concentrate wealth and power in few hands while many struggle. We can't simply condemn the past without examining the present, and we can't simply celebrate our achievements without acknowledging their costs. The beer ration system of ancient Sumer is a mirror that reflects uncomfortable truths about how human societies work, have always worked, and continue to work. The workers who received those 5.5 liters of beer each day are long dead. Their names are mostly forgotten. Their hopes and dreams are lost. Their suffering is over. But the patterns they lived within persist. And understanding those patterns, really understanding them, not just knowing the facts but feeling the weight of what they meant, that's our responsibility. Not because we can change the past. We can't. Lu-Nanna died thousands of years ago, and nothing we do now can make his life easier or give him the freedom and dignity he deserved. But because understanding the past might help us change the present and future. If we can see how the beer ration system worked, how it was maintained, how it shaped lives, maybe we can better see our own systems and make different choices.
The Sumerians paid their workers in beer. We pay ours in money. The medium changes, but ask yourself, is the fundamental relationship really that different? Do most people work because they're passionate about their jobs or because they need the money to survive? Do they have real freedom to leave if they don't like their situation, or are they trapped by necessity? Does their compensation reflect the full value they create, or is value being extracted by others? These aren't just historical questions, they're present questions. And the beer ration system of ancient Sumer, for all its distance in time and culture, asks us these questions in a form that's easier to see clearly because it's not our system. We can look at it objectively and recognize its features: the dependency, the exploitation, the sophisticated management of inequality, the ideological justifications, the resistance and accommodation of workers. And then, if we're honest, we can turn that lens on ourselves and ask what a historian 5,000 years from now might say about our systems. Would they look at our wage-labor economy the way we look at the beer ration system? Would they see us as having made progress, or as having simply changed the packaging while maintaining the same basic structures? Would they think we were wise or foolish, compassionate or callous? I don't know the answers to those questions, but I think asking them is important. The workers of ancient Sumer can't speak for themselves anymore. Their voices are lost. But we can remember them. We can try to understand their lives. We can honor their struggles by learning from them. And we can commit to doing better in our own time, knowing that future generations will judge us just as we judge the past. The beer flowed in ancient Sumer for thousands of years. Every day, workers received their rations. Every day, they drank and worked and lived and hoped and suffered and died. The system outlasted any individual, outlasted generations, outlasted dynasties. It seemed eternal to those living within it, but it wasn't. Nothing is. Everything human is temporary, including our own systems and our own civilization. So we stand here, 5,000 years later, looking back at those ancient workers receiving their daily beer. We see them through archaeology and cuneiform texts and scholarly analysis. We see them imperfectly and partially, but we see them. And in seeing them, maybe we can see ourselves more clearly too. Maybe we can recognize that we're not so different from them, still working, still trying to survive, still living within systems we didn't fully choose, still hoping for something better. The beer ration system of ancient Sumer is gone, but its lessons remain if we're willing to learn them. And those lessons are uncomfortable because they suggest that the most basic structures of economic life, the relationship between labor and compensation, between power and dependence, between those who work and those who control, haven't changed as much as we might like to think. So here's what I want you to take away from this. When you hear about ancient civilizations, think about who built them. When you hear about great achievements, ask about the costs. When you hear about economic systems, ask who benefits and who pays. When you hear that something is natural or inevitable, be skeptical. And when you think about your own life and your own work, remember Lu-Nanna and the countless others like him receiving their daily beer and going back to work day after day, year after year, generation after generation. They lived, they mattered, they deserve to be remembered, and their experience has something to teach us about our own lives and our own world, if we're willing to listen. If this made you think, check out the next video.